The churchyard at Ashford was quiet in the way that only churchyards are quiet, a particular hush that belonged not to the absence of sound, but to its arrangement, with rooks shifting in the yew trees, the distant low of cattle on the ridge, and beneath all of it the silence of a place that had grown accustomed to waiting. The grass between the graves was neatly scythed. The stone wall that bounded the yard was intact. Someone had tended this place through every season of the 3 years Edmund Ashford had been gone. He stood at the lych gate with his hat in his hands and let the familiar weight of the place settle over him. His coat was not the coat of a viscount. It was the coat of a man who had walked 18 miles from the coaching road because he could not afford the post-chaise fare, a dark brown thing gone green at the elbows, and his boots were those of a soldier, good and hard and cracked at the ankle seam from a terrain that had never been kind. He looked like a laborer who had mistaken the gait. He was almost 34 years old, and he felt it in every step. He had not written ahead. He had not known for the better part of 18 months where he was. He had been unconscious for 11 days in a Spanish farmhouse, while a woman named Dolores and her daughters kept the wound in his side from corrupting him entirely. He had been too weak to travel for 4 months after that. By the time the British lines had moved south enough to find him, the dispatches reporting him dead had been in London for half a year, and the machinery of inheritance had turned with its usual impersonal efficiency. He had known about the inheritance. A sympathetic captain had broken it to him gently on a cold evening in February, over a camp table with bad brandy between them. Edmund Ashford, Viscount Ashford, presumed killed at the crossing of the Tormes River. Estate in trust pending formal declaration of death. Cousin Gerald already petitioning. He had taken the news in silence and poured his brandy into the dirt and gone to bed. What he had not known about was the grave. He walked through the churchyard slowly, along the row of old Ashford stones, the ones that went back 3 centuries and recorded the family's long tenure in this particular corner of England. He passed his grandfather, his father, his mother, with her dates barely 4 years apart. He passed the small stone for his sister, who had lived only 6 days. He almost did not see his own. It was not where it should have been. It was not in the family row at all. It was set slightly apart, near the east wall where the afternoon light would fall first, positioned so that anyone walking from the church door would see it. A good piece of limestone, shaped cleanly, with the work of an experienced hand. The letters were cut deep and straight. Edmund Charles Ashford, Viscount Ashford, born 1784, fallen at the Tormes, October 1812. Beloved by those who knew the quality of his service. He stood before it for a long time, below the carved lettering, so small he had to bend to read it, was something else entirely. Not a psalm, not the conventional comfort of a scripture line. Instead, a single couplet from a poem he had read at university and never spoken of to anyone, a poem he had kept in his desk, a poem he had thought no one in the world knew he had loved. He had been looking at the wrong stone, because now he saw, set into the low church garden wall beside the east gate, a smaller flat tablet in gray limestone. No dates, no family name, only his initials, and 2 lines in a hand that was not the stonemason's, but carved from someone's instructions. He stood there, in the October light, and felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in 3 years. It was not grief. It was closer to the sensation of being recognized by someone you had not expected to know you at all. If you have only recently found this story, stay with it. What happened in this churchyard is only the beginning, and the woman who carved those initials was fighting her own battle inside that house. What she did to hold that place together, she did for reasons she could not have named, and what he was about to discover would undo everything he thought he understood about why. The house was a quarter-mile on, and he walked toward it with his hat still in his hands. Cecily Vane had been managing Ashford Hall for 2 years and 7 months, which was to say she had been doing it since the week after her father's death. When she had sat down at the estate steward's desk and concluded that no one else would. The accounts had been in a middling state. The tenants had been nervous. The crops had been in the ground and needing decisions made about the autumn drainage, and Mr. Gerald Ashford had been in London attending to his petition at the Courts of Chancery and could not be reached. So she had made the decisions. She had continued to make them. She was 24 years old, and she was the daughter of a steward, which meant that to every family who came to call on Gerald Ashford in his role as heir presumptive and de facto master, she was just a steward's girl who had not yet had the sense to leave. She heard it often enough to have stopped registering the sting. Lady Pemberton had said it at the harvest dinner, behind her fan but audible to the 2 women beside her, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who thought she was doing Cecily a service by making the situation plain. To the county, she was an inconvenience. To Gerald, she was a convenience. That was a different and worse thing. She was in the library when the housekeeper found her, standing at the window that looked out over the park, reading a letter she had received that morning from Mr. Fairweather, and trying to determine whether its legal language added up to what she feared it did. She had her father's old working coat on over her dress, the sleeves pushed back. She had ink on her left hand. "There is a man at the kitchen door," Mrs. Holt said from the doorway. Cecily did not look up. "What sort of man?" "The sort that has walked a considerable distance and will not give his name." "Tell him to go round to the front." She turned a page of the letter. "If he will not, give him bread and a cup and send him on his way." There was a silence from the doorway that had a particular quality to it. The quality of a woman who knew more than she was saying and was choosing her moment. Mrs. Holt had been at Ashford Hall for 31 years. She had her own silences and her own moments, and Cecily had learned to pay attention to both. Cecily set the letter down. She found him in the kitchen passage, standing just inside the door with his hat in his hands, and for 3 full seconds she did not understand what she was looking at. She understood height and breadth and a soldier's way of holding himself, even in a civilian coat gone shabby. She understood a jaw she had seen in the portrait that hung at the top of the east stair. She understood eyes that were gray-green and tired, and fixed on her face with an expression she could not immediately name. He said, "You know who I am." It was not a question. Her hand was on the doorframe. She became aware of this only when she felt it supporting her weight. Because something had shifted in the room, in the air, in the understanding she had been living inside for nearly 3 years. "You are dead," she said. "I was reported dead," he said. The report was mistaken. There was a long pause in which she looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them spoke. The kitchen fire was going. A pot was simmering. Outside, the stable boy was walking the gray horse across the yard the way she had asked him to every afternoon since the gray had gone lame in September. "How long?" she said at last. "I was at the Tormes in October of 1812. I was wounded. Spanish people kept me alive. I came home as soon as I was able to travel and could arrange the passage." She studied his face. Not for resemblance to the portrait. She had settled that question in the first 3 seconds. She was studying something else, the specific quality of his stillness, the way he held the shabbiness of his coat without apology, the way he had said Spanish people kept me alive as if he were stating a plain fact rather than claiming a dramatic one. She released the doorframe. She straightened her back. "Mrs. Holt," she said, "will you please send word to Mr. Fairweather in the village? Tell him he is needed at the hall immediately. Tell him it is a matter of some consequence." She looked at Edmund Ashford. "And you will need to eat something before we deal with any of it." He blinked. Something moved in his face, very briefly, that she thought might have been surprise. "Come in," she said. "Sit down." The weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing in the law is simple, and nothing involving Gerald Ashford's ambitions was easily unwound. The courts of Chancery did not reverse a declaration of presumed death in an afternoon. Mr. Fairweather was diligent and alarmed in equal measure. Edmund's identity required formal attestation, which required the testimony of men who had known him before the war, 3 of whom were in London and 1 of whom was dead, and the whole business occupied a grinding fortnight of letters and depositions and careful legal correspondence. During that fortnight, Edmund lived at the Hall as its owner. It was the only thing to do. He could not be housed in the village as a stranger, and the nearest house with any connection to him was 12 miles distant. He occupied his own rooms. He ate at his own table. He sat at his own desk and read through 2 years and 7 months of accounts in Cecily's careful hand, the ledgers and tenant correspondence and drainage records and grain inventories, and the meticulous log of decisions made and reasons given. He read it all. He did not speak about what he read. He asked practical questions in precise language, and she answered them in kind, and they arranged themselves, by some unspoken agreement, into a working order that was efficient and polite and thoroughly guarded on both sides. He was not cold to her. He was correct. There was a difference, and she felt it, though she could not have said what it signified. Gerald came on the 5th day. He came with 2 of his London friends and a solicitor of his own, and the confident tread of a man who expected his objections to be consequential. He was 41, broad, with a clergyman's grooming and a gambler's eyes, and the smile of a man who had spent 30 years being pleasant, because pleasantness was cheaper than kindness and produced many of the same results. He had always been pleasant to Cecily. He had been pleasant in the particular way of a man who has decided a woman is useful and has not yet decided what to do when she is no longer needed. He arrived in the drawing room to find Edmund already there, standing at the mantelpiece with a cup of tea, and the quality of Gerald's smile changed in a way that Cecily, watching from the doorway, found instructive. "Cousin," Edmund said. "My God," Gerald said. "Not quite," Edmund said, "though I understand there was some ambiguity on that point for a time." The pleasantness left Gerald's face. Cecily had never seen it leave Gerald's face before. What was under it was less interesting than she had expected. Not calculation. Not fury. Only a kind of deflation, the particular expression of a man who has built something and now watches it fall with a resignation that contained no surprise. He turned to Cecily. "Well?" he said, and his voice had flattened. "I suppose you have been very useful, Miss Vane. Just a steward's girl after all." She had heard that voice before, heard it from Gerald's acquaintances, heard it reported back to her by the housekeeper who had been in the hall when a London guest had said it within easy hearing of 3 servants. She had heard it as community verdict, as social fact, as the thing the county had decided she was, a woman holding a post above her station, soon to be corrected. She said nothing. She met his eyes and was quiet, which was the most accurate response she had available. "You may address yourself to Mr. Fairweather," Edmund said from the mantelpiece, in a voice that had not changed in temperature, but had acquired a precision that made the room feel smaller. "He will advise you on the procedural timeline for the reversal of the declaration. I will not be receiving you for personal discussion today." Gerald looked at him for a long moment. "I managed this estate for 2 years, Gerald said. "Miss Vane managed this estate for 2 years, Edmund said. "You managed the petition in London." The brevity of it was not unkind. It was exact. Cecily found, unexpectedly, that she needed to look at the window. The months he had spent in the Spanish farmhouse had changed him in ways that were not visible in the first fortnight, or rather they became visible in a specific order, the way damage and repair both reveal themselves slowly, each at its own pace. She learned that he did not sleep past 5 in the morning because he had trained himself not to during the long illness when sleeping through the critical hours had meant dying. She learned that he ate sparingly, not from any fashionable constraint, but because he had been genuinely hungry for long enough that abundance still faintly alarmed him. She learned that he was not comfortable in large rooms for reasons he did not explain and did not need to, because the reason was written in the way he positioned himself near exits and went still at sudden sounds. She learned that he carried a letter in the breast pocket of his coat. She saw him touch it twice, the same brief gesture in moments when he thought he was unobserved. Once at the desk when the accounts mentioned the name of a tenant who had apparently died the previous winter, and once at the window looking out over the park in the late light of an October afternoon that matched, she suspected, some private interior calendar she could not access. She did not ask about the letter. She had no claim on his private griefs. What she had was the practical fluency of 2 years and 7 months of running his house, which meant she understood his estate better than he did at present, and she was not able to pretend otherwise, and what he had was the specific intelligence of a man who had been watching how she worked for a fortnight and had concluded that the work was sound. It produced a strange kind of honesty between them. Neither of them was performing. There was too much to do. One morning she came into the kitchen early to find him there before her, sitting at the table with the estate map unrolled and a cup of cold tea at his elbow, and he did not look up when she entered, only moved the map a fraction to make room for her cup on the table, and she sat down across from him and picked up the thread of the drainage question, and they worked for an hour before Mrs. Holt arrived and expressed no surprise at all. It was on a Tuesday in mid-November that he saw her with the child. She had not known he was in the East Wing that afternoon. She had thought he was with Fairweather in the study, working through the last of the inheritance documents. She had gone to the old nursery rooms on the East Passage because the young daughter of the Alderton tenant family was ill with a chest complaint, and Mrs. Alderton had nowhere to put her but was too occupied with the farm to sit with her, and Cecily had been sitting with her for 2 afternoons a week for the better part of a month. The child was 8 years old and had been told she was too sick to go to lessons, and had taken this as a personal insult to her intelligence. Cecily had borrowed a book from the library to address this grievance. It happened to be one of the better natural philosophy volumes, the one with the colored plates of insects and birds, and she was reading the description of a common swift's migration patterns aloud, while the child looked at the plate and argued, with considerable medical authority, that the bird looked entirely too small to fly from England to Africa and back. She was in the middle of a sentence about the swift's wingspan when she became aware that someone was standing in the doorway. She looked up. He was very still. His shoulder was against the doorframe, and his arms were crossed, and his face was doing something she had not seen it do before. It had lost its guard, not entirely, but in the way that happens to careful faces in moments they have not prepared for. A fraction of softness at the eyes, a slight ease in the jaw, the expression of a man who has seen something he did not expect and cannot immediately recover from. She did not move. The child had not noticed him yet. He looked at Cecily. The look lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he straightened from the doorframe, turned, and was gone without a word. She sat with the child for another half an hour, and then walked back through the corridor to the library, and found him there, standing at the window that looked out over the church garden, his back to the door. "There is a bed of rosemary between the vicarage gate and the south wall," he said, without turning. "It was not there when I left. I planted it 2 winters ago," she said. The south wall holds heat, and rosemary dries well. Mrs. Holt uses it. And the stone, he said. In the wall beside the east gate, with the initials and the couplet. She was quiet. He turned from the window. His face was back in its composed order, but the composure had a quality she had not seen in it before. Not coldness, not distance, but something more carefully held. The way a man holds something that has become unexpectedly fragile. I read that poem at university, he said. I kept it in this desk. There is no record of it anywhere in the estate papers. There is no record of it anywhere outside this room. No, she said. You found it. When I was cataloging the books, she said. There was a folded paper tucked inside the third volume of the Natural Philosophy set. Your handwriting? I thought, if there was to be any memorial at all, it ought to contain something that was actually yours. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside the window, the afternoon light was going, the particular flat gray of November closing over the park. The large stone, he said, with the full inscription. That was Gerald, she said. He commissioned it in the first month. I had no authority to prevent it. I could only add the other. He nodded, once, slowly. He turned back to the window. The couplet, he said. Did you choose it? Because you thought it accurate? She considered the question honestly. I chose it because it was in your hand, she said. And because you had kept it. I thought that meant it was true of you. Whatever had been true of you. The silence that followed was not empty. She felt the weight of what had not been said in it, the long months of his absence, the particular loneliness of tending something belonging to someone who did not know you existed, the strangeness of caring for a man's house and a man's memory, and a man's private copy of a poem, and never having exchanged a word with the man himself before the morning. He appeared in the kitchen passage with his hat in his hands. She had built a private memorial for a man she had never met. She had not let herself think, in the 2 weeks since he had walked through the door, about what that meant. I should return to the accounts, she said. Cecily, he said. She stopped. He had not used her given name before. He had been scrupulously formal, Miss Vane at every point, in the way of a man observing a propriety that was also a wall. She stood very still. He did not turn from the window. I have been trying to understand, he said, and his voice was level, the words placed with care. How a person comes to tend another person's grave for 2 years, not as a duty. The rosemary was not duty. The stone was not duty. The book with the child was not duty. She said nothing. I am not, he said, asking you to account for it. I am trying to find the right language for what I want to say next, and I do not yet have it. Outside, the rooks had come back to the yew trees and were settling with their particular racket. The sound of the churchyard in the late afternoon. The sound she had heard every evening from this window for 2 years and 7 months. I am not going anywhere, she said at last. Not as comfort, as fact. He turned from the window then, and the expression on his face was one she recognized, because she had seen it in the kitchen passage on the day he arrived and had not known then what it was. She knew now. It was the expression of a man who has been expecting to come home to nothing and has found something instead, and does not yet trust himself to name it. No, he said. I can see that. If the weight of that moment has settled somewhere in you, leave it there, for now. That feeling is what this story has been building toward, and what comes next is going to require it. Gerald moved quickly once it became clear that the legal reversal was proceeding and that his petition was not going to survive it. He was not a man who surrendered ground quietly. He gathered what leverage remained to him, which amounted to two things. The whisper campaign he had been quietly running through the county for 6 months, and the dinner he had already arranged at Pemberton Hall for the first week of December, to which half the county had been invited, and at which Edmund Ashford had also been invited, in a letter Gerald had sent before he knew Edmund had returned, under the assumption that a new Viscount might wish to be formally introduced to the neighborhood. Edmund had accepted. It was the correct thing to do. He had not known, when he accepted, that Gerald intended to use the occasion. She found out the shape of it from Mrs. Holt, who had it from the Pemberton housekeeper, who had it from the Pemberton butler, which was the usual route by which the county's intelligence traveled. Gerald had been speaking to Lady Pemberton about the estate, about the management of it, about the considerable irregularity of a steward's daughter having operated as de facto chatelaine for 2.5 years. He had been speaking in particular about the accounts and the decisions made therein, the drainage work contracted in 1813, the tenancy renegotiations of the previous spring, the substantial discretionary expenditure Cecily had authorized for the repairs to the south barn. He had been framing all of it in the language of impropriety. Not theft. He was too careful for that. Mismanagement was the word he reached for. Overreach. A young woman of uncertain station. Making decisions she had no authority to make. Spending money that was not hers to spend. Entrenching herself in a house where she had no permanent claim. Just a steward's girl who had not known her place. She heard Mrs. Holt out, and thanked her, and went upstairs to dress for the dinner, with her hands very steady, and her jaw very set. The dinner at Pemberton Hall was 38 people, which was the kind of gathering that could not be called intimate and could not be called impersonal. Cecily arrived with Edmund and Mrs. Holt in Edmund's carriage, which was correct and appropriate, and had required no arrangement, because Edmund had simply said, at breakfast, "You will come with me." And she had said, "Yes, my lord," because there had been no reasonable answer. But yes. Gerald was already there. He made his bow to Edmund with all the surface pleasantness intact and something new beneath it, a watchfulness that had replaced the simple deflation of the earlier encounter. He was reading the room. He was reading her position in it. He was reading Edmund. Lady Pemberton seated them apart, as she would, and the dinner proceeded as dinners in November in the English countryside proceeded, with the fish and the removes, and the usual traffic of conversation across a table that was too long for intimacy and too short for privacy. It was in the second remove that Gerald began. He had Lady Pemberton on his left and the Ashford solicitor's wife on his right, and he spoke at a volume designed to be heard by the 4 people nearest him, which included the Reverend Alderton and his wife. "Irregular," he said reflectively, as if continuing a thread, though no thread had been visible to the rest of the table. The whole arrangement was irregular. I raised it at the time, of course. A young woman, however capable, is not an estate manager. There are reasons we do not arrange these things in that way. Lady Pemberton's fan moved slightly. "The accounts appeared sound," said the Reverend Alderton, with the careful tone of a man who was not sure which side of a conversation he had been conscripted into. "Oh, the accounts," Gerald said pleasantly. "We will know more about the accounts when Mr. Fairweather has completed the full review. There may be some surprises there. There often are, in these situations. Not from malice, simply from the particular confidence that sometimes overtakes a person who has been given more latitude than their background has prepared them for." Cecily was seated 9 chairs down and heard approximately half of this. She heard enough. She set her fork down. She did not look at Gerald. She looked across the table at the candles in the central arrangement and let her breathing slow and let the warmth of the room, which had been pleasant 5 minutes ago, and was now something else, resolve itself into a simple question. She had the accounts. She had every receipt, every letter, every contract. She had the drainage reports, and the tenant correspondence, and the grain figures, and the South Barn survey. She had kept records in the specific way of a woman who knows she is operating without formal authority, and has therefore documented every decision twice. Gerald Ashford could say whatever he liked tonight. He was speaking into a record that contradicted him on every point. She knew this, and he did not know she knew it, and that was enough. What she had not anticipated was Edmund. She had not been watching his face. She had been watching the candles and managing her breathing and calculating what Mr. Fairweather would need and how quickly it could be assembled, and she had not noticed him set his own glass down or push back his chair or cross the distance between his seat and hers in the specific way that a man moves when he has decided something, and the decision is already behind him. She noticed him when he stopped beside her chair. The table had gone quiet. These things happen at dinners, the way a conversation thins and a silence spreads, and when it spreads at the wrong moment, it spreads fast. 38 people had very little to say to each other for the 3 seconds it took Edmund Ashford to set his hand on Cecily Vane's shoulder, briefly, in a gesture that was not theatrical, and was not gentle, and was not ambiguous. The simple weight of a hand that was telling the room something true. Gerald had stopped talking. Lady Pemberton had stopped moving her fan. Edmund looked at Gerald down the length of the table. "This is Miss Cecily Vane," he said. "In 2 years and 7 months she kept 1,200 acres, 11 tenancies, a disputed drainage easement, and 3 outstanding debts in order without a penny of her own money, and without formal instruction from anyone. She did it correctly. She did it more correctly than many men with twice the authority and 3 times the resources would have done. The accounts are not in question. She is not in question." His voice had not risen. It did not need to. "She is my wife." Not his future wife. Not the woman he intended to honor. Not a declaration of intention. "She is my wife." 3 words and their article and pronoun spoken in the past tense in a tone that treated the sentence as a statement of existing fact, leaving the room to work out for itself that this was a man who had already decided and was simply informing the county. The table was very still. Cecily's hand was in her lap, and it had gone still too. The particular stillness of a hand that does not trust itself to move for fear of what motion might mean. Gerald's face had lost its pleasantness again. There was nothing under it this time. Not even deflation. Only the blank look of a man who has played a card and watched it lose without understanding why. Lady Pemberton looked from Gerald to Edmund to Cecily and back, and then, with the particular quality of a woman of 60 who has seen the county through 3 generations and knows which way a room is turning, she picked up her glass and said, in a carrying voice, "We should drink to the Viscount's return. He has been too long away." The table came back to life. Cecily looked up at Edmund. He was still standing beside her chair. His expression was composed, but the composure had that quality she had come to recognize, the careful hold, the slight tension at the jaw that meant the surface was doing work. "You cannot simply," she said, in a voice low enough for only him, "announce a thing like that?" "I have announced it," he said, equally low. "We have not discussed it." "No," he said. "We have not." He looked at her. "I intended to discuss it before tonight. I was finding the language difficult. Gerald made the timing a requirement rather than an option." The briefest pause. "I have the language now, if you want it." She looked at him for a long moment. The dinner was resuming around them, and they were standing in it like two people inside their own weather. "You said you were trying to understand," she said. "I have understood." "And what have you understood?" He sat down in the empty chair to her left, which was not his assigned seat and was not correct, and which he did not appear to consider as a problem. "I have understood," he said, "that a person does not tend a grave, or plant rosemary in a south wall, or sit with another man's tenant's child and read to her about swifts, because of duty. A person does those things because the place has entered them, because the people in it have entered them, because they have found, in the absence of the person who should have been there, that they cannot stop caring for the things that person would have cared for." He paused. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance with the particular face of a man who is saying a thing carefully. "I also understand that this is not a statement a man makes about a woman he has known for 6 weeks. I know that. I am not asking you to receive it as finished and settled. I am asking you to receive it as true." Cecily was quiet for a moment. She was thinking of the letter in his breast pocket, which she had never asked about, and the natural philosophy book, and the cold tea at his elbow, and the estate map unrolled on the kitchen table, and the way he had looked in the East Passage doorway watching her read to a child. "The letter you carry," she said. He was still for a moment. Then he reached into his coat and produced it. A folded paper, much handled, the fold lines soft with repetition. He set it on the table between them. He did not unfold it. "My sergeant," he said. "He died at the Torms. He had a daughter in Shropshire. I promised him I would write to her if he did not come back. I wrote to her from Spain before I was strong enough to travel. I received a letter from her in return. She is 12 years old, and she writes a very clear hand." He was quiet for a moment. "I have been trying to decide how to tell her that her father was not simply a good soldier, that he was a particular kind of person, careful and steady and accurate, in the specific way that good people often are. I have been trying to find the language for that, too." She looked at the folded letter. She looked at his hands on the table. "You will find it," she said. "You have the language for more than you think." He looked at her then, and the expression she had seen in the kitchen passage and in the library and in the East Passage doorway was there again. That fraction of openness behind the composed surface, the careful hold loosening at the very last. "Will you give me time," he said, "to do this properly?" It was not quite a question, and not quite a command. It was the specific register of a man who was accustomed to issuing instructions and was trying, with visible effort, to ask instead. She thought about the churchyard in October, the rooks in the yew trees, the flat gray tablet in the wall with its 2 careful lines, the way it had felt to choose those words for a man she had never met, to stand in the cut-grass silence of the church garden and think, "This was the most honest thing I could give to a stranger, and if it is never read, I will have given it anyway." "Yes," she said, "I will give you time." The winter that came was the kind that settles early and stays, the kind that turns the park silver in the mornings and keeps the fires going in every room and makes the evenings long and quiet in a way that is, in the right house, not lonesome at all. Gerald Ashford withdrew his petition to the Court of Chancery in the 2nd week of December, which Mr. Fairweather characterized as prudent, and the Reverend Alderton characterized as overdue, and Mrs. Holt characterized with a look that required no words. Edmund wrote his letter to the girl in Shropshire, and received an answer that pleased him so much he read it aloud to Cecily at the breakfast table, and she listened with her tea going cold and her throat tighter than she had any dignified reason for, because it was a child's letter about her father, and it was also, obliquely, a letter about what it meant to be held in a good person's memory, and she suspected Edmund had understood that when he chose to read it aloud. The formal business was conducted with all appropriate ceremony in mid-January, before the vicar at Ashford Church, with Mrs. Holt and Mr. Fairweather as witnesses. The church cold enough that their breath showed, and the winter light very white through the clear windows. Edmund's hands were warm. He took her right hand, and then her left hand, and kept hold of both of them for a moment after the words were done, looking at her with the expression she had finally learned to read, the careful hold loosening, the thing behind it given its proper name. She thought, briefly and without embarrassment, about the stone in the churchyard wall, the flat gray tablet with his initials, and the 2 lines she had chosen because they had been in his hand, because he had kept them, because she had thought that whatever was true of him, this was true. She was not wrong. She had simply not known when she carved the memorial that the life in question was not finished. On the evening of the day of the wedding, when the candles were lit and the house was quiet, and the first snow of the new year was beginning to come down outside the library window, she took the natural philosophy book from the shelf where it had been since she had borrowed it for the child in November, and replaced it in its proper place in the east wall of the library, in the gap between the 2nd and 3rd volumes where a folded paper had once lived. Edmund was at the desk behind her. She heard the scratch of his pen stop. She did not turn around. She ran her finger along the spine of the book and thought about swifts, who fly from England to Africa and back on wings too small for the journey by any reasonable measure, who find their way home in the dark by a means no one has ever fully explained. "It is still there," she said. "The paper. The poem. Back where it belonged." "Yes," he said. His voice was quiet and close, and she understood that he had come around the desk at some point and was standing behind her, not touching her. The particular proximity that needed no gesture, just presence, just the warmth of a person standing in the cold air a foot away. She turned. The fire was going, and the snow was going, and the candle on the desk was burning very low, and Edmund Ashford was looking at her with the look she had given up trying to interpret separately from its consequence. She took the folded paper from her pocket, the one she had been keeping there since October, when she had meant to return it to him, and had not yet found the occasion, the poem in his own hand, the words she had given to the stonemason in the church garden on a gray morning 2 years ago, when she had thought she was honoring a stranger. She held it out to him. He took it. He looked at it. He looked at her. He put it back in his breast pocket, where it had always been, where she suspected it would remain. Outside the window, the snow was coming down on the park and the churchyard and the stone wall by the east gate, covering everything gently, the way the English countryside receives a new season, without ceremony, without announcement, simply by changing, quietly and completely, into what it was always going to become. The candle burned, the fire held, the snow fell. She was home. If this story found its way to you tonight, and if Cecily's long, quiet faithfulness moved you in some way you might want to name, leave it in the comments. The stories that earn their endings are worth keeping close.